Al cumplirse un mes del pronunciamiento de las Fuerzas Armadas y de Carabineros, hemos querido llegar a esta tribuna a presentar al pueblo de Chile la situación en que hemos encontrado la nación y las repercusiones que en todo orden significan para su desenvolvimiento como país libre y soberano.
El país transita por una de las etapas más difíciles de su historia. Colocado al borde de la disgregación, la intervención de las Fuerzas Armadas ha constituido la única alternativa posible frente al deterioro provocado por el desgobierno, la corrupción y la complacencia. Por múltiples causas, un notorio vacío de poder fue minando a ritmo cada vez más acelerado las posibilidades del ejercicio de la autoridad, condición esencial para el desenvolvimiento del Estado. Las Fuerzas Armadas, conscientes que la continuación normal del proceso no ofrecía un futuro aceptable para el país, produjeron la única respuesta posible a esta crítica situación. Pero debe quedar claro que los hechos acaecidos el 24 de marzo de 1976 no materializan solamente la caída de un gobierno, el cierre definitivo de un ciclo histórico y la apertura de uno nuevo, cuya característica fundamental estará dada por la tarea de reorganizar la nación, emprendida con real vocación de servicio por las Fuerzas Armadas.
I take pride in the words, ich bin ein Berliner.
November 28th, 1975, Santiago, Chile. It was the closing session of the first Inter-American Meeting on National Intelligence, a week-long gathering hosted by Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet with the help of his spy chief Manuel Contreras. The attendees included intelligence and military officials from 5 Latin American military dictatorships: Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Paraguay. During the meeting, the participating regime signed on to a proposal of collaboration. This marked the birth of Operation Condor, a secret transnational network for intelligence sharing and coordination of cross-border repression. Though some of these countries had cooperated with each other before, this marked a turning point, formalizing their alliance under a single framework designed for violent political suppression. This network operated as a shadow structure, parallel to official state institutions, similar to a rogue version of Interpol. The overarching purpose of Operation Condor was simple: the total annihilation of left-wing ideas and activities in Latin America. This is because the governments involved in this criminal conspiracy, the Condor states, were all built on militarism, nationalism, and authoritarian conservatism. Thus, they saw leftist ideology as a threat to their power and to traditional social order. Particularly, leaders like Pinochet had watched the fall of the Batista regime in Cuba and were determined not to suffer the same fate. However, Operation Condor wasn't just about killing political enemies. It was about sending a message. Specifically, a message of terror to the population, calculated to make sure no one dared to challenge the political order. Naturally, Pinochet took the lead in Condor's early years, having seized power in a bloody 1973 coup against a democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende. Pinochet had already gained an international reputation as a ruthless anti-communist. With Chile as the center of operations, the Condor states began to implement their terrifying vision. The United States, long active in Latin American affairs, took a keen interest in Operation Condor. U.S. national security officials also feared, quote, another Cuba, and saw large segments of Latin American society as potentially or actively subversive. In this context, Washington became a covert supporter and facilitator of Condor. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, under Presidents Nixon and Ford, reassured Condor leaders of continued US backing during multiple visits. Evident of the close cooperation between Condor states and the US, Manuel Contreras, head of Pinochet's secret police, was himself a paid CIA contact until 1977. While Operation Condor system was organized into 3 phases, that label is somewhat misleading, as Condor was not executed in chronological phases, but overlapping levels of coordination and action that were simultaneously ongoing. Phase 1 involved collaboration between military intelligence services of the Condor states. These agencies shared surveillance data and coordinated efforts to monitor, harass, and track suspected dissidents. Phase 2 was covert action. Multinational Condor death squads were set up to carry out clandestine cross-border operations to kidnap exiles and bring them back to their home countries, where most faced torture, sexual violence, or execution. In many cases, it was a combination of all 3. Victims were often held in secret detention centers, some of which were hidden in dense city centers, others in rural areas. What's in common is that for most, once they enter, there's no coming back out. Some didn't even have the luxury of a quick death by bullets and were subjected to the infamous death flights, where they were loaded onto planes and helicopters and then thrown out over oceans or mountains. A notable case of Phase 2 operations occurred in 1976, when 2 exiled Uruguayan legislators, Zelmar Michelini and Hector Ruiz, were abducted in Buenos Aires. Days later, their bodies were found riddled with bullets, with clear signs that they were tortured before they were killed. Phase 3 was the most daring and secretive: assassinations of political opponents outside of Latin America. The most well-known instance of Phase 3 operations also occurred in 1976 in Washington, D.C., where Chilean politician Orlando Letelier, a former minister under Allende, was killed by a car bomb. His assistant Ronnie Moffett, an American citizen, was killed alongside him. The attack took place in broad daylight, just blocks away from the White House in Sheridan Circle. The CIA was almost certainly aware of the plot to kill Letelier on American soil, but shockingly did nothing to prevent it from happening, even when it entailed American collateral casualties. However, this wasn't the only time the US government turned a blind eye to the murder of American citizens by Condor states. In 1973, when Pinochet first took power in Chile, his regime executed American journalist Charles Horman, and the US government did nothing to prevent his death or even to protest afterwards. Then, in 1976, when the CIA discovered an Uruguayan plot to kill US Congressman Edward Koch, who was responsible for ending military aid to Uruguay, the inaction was even more jarring. Here was the life of a member of Congress on the line, and while then CIA Director George H.W. Bush did personally warn Koch, little else was done. Even when Koch approached the CIA and FBI requesting protection, he was simply turned away. This chilling episode underscored Washington's quiet tolerance for Condor's brutality. The US had evidence that one of its own elected officials was targeted for assassination, and yet its support for the Condor regimes remained unwavering throughout their existence. This attitude reflected a Cold War mindset in Washington that prioritized anti-communism above all else, often leading to troubling compromises on moral issues. An example of this line of thinking is the Kirkpatrick Doctrine, articulated by Reagan-era U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Jeane Kirkpatrick. She argued that authoritarian regimes, even the most brutal ones, were preferable to revolutionary regimes because they were more likely to align with U.S. interests and less ideologically extreme. Of course, that assertion remains highly debatable. In its Phase 3 activities, international assassinations, Condor's operatives didn't act alone. Intelligence agencies like Chile's DINA and Argentina's CIDE often collaborated with local far-right or neo-fascist groups to carry out attacks, which they have done in places like Italy and the US. There were also plans to establish a permanent Condor presence in Europe, indicative of the Condor state's growing appetite, This was so operatives could attack and disrupt European leftist organizations like the Basque separatist group, ETA, and the Irish Republican Army. However, this plan was quickly abandoned after the secrecy of Condor activities in Europe was blown, and Phase 3 was permanently discontinued. Unfortunately, for people across Latin America, Phases 1 and 2 were alive and well, and were to continue for years to come. Indeed, domestically in the Condor states, the repression was even more brutal. Free from the diplomatic complications of international assassinations, these regimes unleashed the full force of Operation Condor on domestic revolutionary groups, such as the Chilean Revolutionary Left Movement, the Argentinian Montoneros, and the Uruguayan Tupamaros, as well as their own people. Across the continent, a staggering number of civilians suddenly vanished during a wave of terror in the mid to late 1970s known as the Dirty Wars. People would often leave for work or school, then never reach their destination. It was like they never existed. In each country, Operation Condor had created the perfect environment for the expansion of state terrorism. Underground detention sites, systemic torture in the most gruesome ways imaginable, and of course, mass disappearances. Some of the most notorious facilities included Londres 38 and Villa Grimaldi in Chile, as well as Garage Azopardo, Ano Motores Orletti, and El Campito in Argentina. These 5 locations alone accounted for thousands of individuals who were simply wiped off the face of the earth, without even bodies to identify. Operation Condor also involved member governments urging citizens to report on each other, framing it as a patriotic responsibility. This further enhanced the oppressive atmosphere Operation Condor aimed to bring about, in order to instill fear in the population where no one could trust anybody, not even within families. In some horrifying accounts, pregnant female prisoners, who were still beaten and abused like the others, would have their babies taken away from them after giving birth. They themselves will then be immediately killed. Their children will be sold to couples the regime deemed proper, usually from the police or military. A system was even set up so couples could sometimes choose their birth-giving detainee, based on a description of her looks and level of education. Foreign nationals were not spared either. If they were collaborating or assisting political dissidents, they found themselves on Operation Condor's hit list. Notably, 2 French nuns, Sister Alice Damon and Sister Leonie Duquette, who devoted themselves to social work amongst Argentina's poorest neighborhoods, found themselves in this precise situation. In 1977, a movement known as the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, composed of mothers whose children were disappeared by the government, started protesting in the streets and demanding answers. The 2 sisters became involved with the group, and eventually, both were kidnapped, tortured, and killed. Several leaders of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo also met the same fate. Towards the end of the 1970s, relations between Chile and Argentina had worsened significantly due to a border dispute, which eventually led to Condor activity slowing down as cooperation began to stop. In 1983, the Argentinian junta collapsed after losing the Falklands War and leading the country into economic crisis. Additionally, human rights advocacy groups were leveling mounting pressure on the Condor states, leading to worldwide news coverage that compromised the secrecy of their operations. With that, Operation Condor gradually and eventually came to an end. But its conclusion came too late. Throughout 8 years of existence, Operation Condor's victims reached a staggering 80,000 people, of which around 30,000 were executed, 20 to 30,000 disappeared, and 20,000 were eventually released after being illegally imprisoned and tortured. Countless families were broken up, with children pried away from the arms of their parents, and loved ones forced to watch each other suffer in silence. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the various Condor states began transitioning back to democratic civilian rule, and some started to put their old leaders on trial. However, due to the secretive nature of Condor activities, the extent of the atrocities will not be truly understood until at least a decade later. The process of putting former Condor state leaders on trial would also prove to be a lengthy and difficult process, as many of those responsible would pass away before facing legal consequences. Out of the original 5 leaders who led their countries during most of Operation Condor's existence, Chile's Augusto Pinochet died in house arrest on December 10, 2006, never having been convicted of any crimes. Pinochet's right-hand man, Manuel Contreras, drifted in and out of prisons for many years, as court decisions were overturned and reinstated several times. He died in a hospital in 2015. Argentina's Jorge Rafael Videla died in prison in 2013 while serving a life sentence. Out of his successors and fellow junta members, Emilio Eduardo Massera also received a life sentence. Roberto Viola received 17 years. Armando Lamborghini received 8 years. Orlando Agosti received 4 years and a half, while 4 others were acquitted. Ronaldo Benilne, while initially also acquitted, was eventually convicted on multiple counts of crimes against humanity and sent to prison. He died in a hospital in 2018. Uruguay's Juan Maria Bordaberry was convicted in 2010, but died 1 year later in 2011 under house arrest. His successor, Gregorio Alvarez, was sentenced to 25 years in prison in 2009 and died in prison in 2016. Bolivia's Hugo Benzer Suarez was never convicted or faced any legal consequences for his government's actions during Operation Condor. He was re-elected president in a democratic Bolivia in 1997 and served until 2001. As for Paraguay's Alfredo Stroessner, in addition to his government's human rights abuses, he was also a known sexual predator. Despite this, Stroessner was never tried or convicted, having fled to Brazil after his regime was overthrown in 1989. He died in the capital Brasilia in 2006, without facing any consequences. Fast forward to the present. Despite many of these repressive leaders perishing one after the other, the scar they left on Latin America as a whole still lingers on. On a macro level, the continent still struggles to overcome the legacy of political violence and instability, which can be attributed in many ways to the decades of brutal authoritarian rule it had endured. This period also continues to influence many Latin American leaders, who unfortunately find themselves on the slippery slope of drifting into the dangerous grip of autocracy. However, let us draw our attention to the human level for a brief moment, and acknowledge the harm Operation Condor and its repression had caused the people. Despite breakthroughs in archival research and the declassification of numerous documents, countless families are still searching for answers, desperate to uncover the fate of their loved ones and to make sense of the enduring trauma left in the wake of Operation Condor. Their pain, as well as the memory of the tens of thousands of victims, stand as a haunting testament to the perils of political extremism and state-sponsored terror, no matter what ideology it claims to serve. I hope you enjoyed this episode. What do you make of the story of Operation Condor? What other lasting impacts on Latin American consciousness do you think it left behind? Let me know in the comments. If you would like to see more videos on Cold War related topics, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. See you next time.